The wounds suffered by Nicole and Ron in the murder scene were taken from the autopsy reports. A common-sense approach was applied to depict the order that the wounds were inflicted for the purposes of the reenactment, and was based in part upon the testimony of the coroner. The first wound depicted is based on the belief that Nicole would have had the greatest resistance prior to the first strike. The autopsy described it as a 1/8 inch superficial slit-like incision into the skin and dermis of the left side of the neck. The second wound depicted is a clear and unobstructed strike. To put the depth of this wound in perspective, the diameter of Nicole's neck would have been an estimated 4 to 4.5 inches. The autopsy reports the minimal depth of the penetration from left to right is 1.5 to 2 inches, which is almost halfway through her neck. The report goes on to say that injury to the internal jugular vein or common carotid artery cannot be excluded. Nicole then protects her neck with her left hand. The third wound described is a punctate abrasion, red-brown in color at the base of the ring finger, which may or may not have been from the point of the knife. The fourth wound depicted, also to the left hand, is described as a 1/2 inch superficial incised skin cut, diagonally oriented, on the top of the left hand mid-portion. The fifth wound is to the left side of the scalp. It measures a 1/2 inch in length, and depth of penetration is through the scalp, approximately 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. At this point, these wounds are already causing Nicole to lose her senses. The remaining 2 strikes to the left side of her neck are met with little resistance. Wound 6 is a diagonally oriented stab wound measuring 7/8 of an inch in length, and the depth of penetration is 1.5 inches. The report states that this stab wound may have injured the left carotid artery and/or the left jugular vein. The seventh wound depicted is a diagonally oriented stab wound measuring a 1/2 inch in length and has a depth of penetration for 1.5 to 2 inches. This stab wound also may have injured the left common carotid artery and/or the left internal jugular vein. At this point, the reenactment depicts Nicole losing consciousness and her ability to remain standing. In her final effort to resist, she turns to her left and grabs OJ's arm to try and stop the onslaught, then simply drops to her knees. OJ then inflicts the 8th wound depicted with the butt of the knife. Blunt force injury to head. The precise location of this wound was the right side of the scalp, 4 inches above the right ear, and the bruise measured 1 by 1 inches, with associated deep scalp hemorrhage. With Nicole now slumped over the steps, OJ inflicts the 9th wound depicted, a stab wound or cutting wound of scalp in the right posterior region. The wound measures 1.5 inches in length, and its depth of penetration is 3/8 to 1.5 inches, with fresh, deep scalp bruising. Nicole's blood is shown to have gotten on OJ's sock as a result of cast-off from the knife. Nicole's final defense will be covering the right side of her neck with her right hand. The 10th wound depicted is a 16th inch punctate abrasion on the back of her right hand at the base of the ring finger. The next stabbing depicted will inflict 2 wounds simultaneously. To avoid Nicole's hand, OJ shifts his strike toward the scalp again, and ends up slicing a 5/8 of an inch incised wound on the palm side of Nicole's right index finger by the top knuckle for wound 11, before inflicting a 3/16 inch stab wound to the scalp for wound 12. With Ron approaching, this would be OJ's last stabbing inflicted upon Nicole. The fact that the stab wound of Ron's left thigh had bled so profusely tells us that it was probably one of the first wounds inflicted. It is the very first wound inflicted in the reenactment. The actual location was 33 inches above the left heel and 4 inches from the back of the thigh, which would place the point of entry about here. The autopsy report states that the depth of penetration is 3 to 3.5 inches from left to right without angulation or deviation, which suggests that OJ struck from a crouched position. Ron had a 1.5 by 3/4 inch superficial non-patterned red-brown abrasion on the right side of his cheek, which may or may not have been caused by a blow to the face. Ron is shown to be knocked down, though, because there were stab marks on the bottom of his boot. The next stab wound shown is a defensive wound of the left hand at the web of the thumb as OJ comes in to strike. It measured 3/4 of an inch in length and approximately 1/4 inch deep. This was immediately followed by 2 more defensive wounds. An incised wound of the right hand at the base of the index finger, 3/4 of an inch in length and a 1/2 inch deep, and a triangular cutting wound also of the right hand near the web of the thumb measuring a 1/2 inch in length and 1/4 inch deep. The next stabbing depicted is the most brutal. Again, because of the amount of bleeding, it was probably inflicted early. It begins on the left side of the neck, at the level of the mid-larynx. It's a gaping opening, 3 inches in length, slicing Ron's left internal jugular vein. The direction of the pathway is upward and slightly front to back for a distance of approximately 4 inches, where it exits behind the ear in another gaping opening 2 inches in length. Clearly, these gaping openings were the result of a tremendous amount of struggling while the knife was in Ron's neck. Because the jugular was severed, this was a fatal wound, and if this were the only wound inflicted, Ron would have bled to death within a few minutes. The nature and location of many of Ron's wounds tells us that they were inflicted while OJ was behind him. What follows is Ron pinning the knife while turning his back toward OJ, forcing OJ to pull back and allowing Ron to become upright. At this point, he pulls OJ's left hand away from his face, ripping off the left glove. Because of the large amount of blood that had run down Ron's left leg from the thigh wound, the reenactment depicts Ron returning to a standing position. 2 3-inch superficial incise wounds of the left neck and a 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch long incisions of the left ear followed. There were at least 3 other superficial incisions of the left neck area not specifically depicted. The next wound depicted is on the right side of the neck and is almost as brutal as the one on the left side. This one was not fatal. The point of entry is 3 inches directly below the right ear and is 5/8 of an inch in length. The direction of the wound path is front to back and upward for a total wound path length of 2 inches, before exiting on the right side of the back of the neck. The exit wound was another 2-inch long gaping stab wound. The next stab wound depicted is 1 inch in length. The wound path cuts the right earlobe as it travels from right to left horizontally for approximately 1 1/4 inches, before terminating in the left temporal bone. This next series of stab wounds starts on the back right region of Ron's scalp, where there's a sharp force wound measuring 5/8 of an inch in length, with a depth of penetration of approximately 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch into the scalp, causing deep scalp hemorrhage beneath the wound. This is immediately followed by a 1/4-inch superficial incise wound penetrating a 1/4 inch into the scalp, in this case causing a small amount of deep scalp hemorrhage. Next is a 3/4-inch superficial incise wound on the right side of the back of the neck. What's depicted next, the autopsy reports as numerous superficial incise wounds or cuts, varied in orientation, involving the skin of the right cheek. The longest is a 3-inch long diagonally oriented superficial incise wound extending from the right side of the forehead to the cheek, and various other superficial wounds vary from 1/2 to 1 inch. At this point in the reenactment, Ron's continuing struggle results in him redirecting the knife so that OJ ends up stabbing himself in the middle knuckle of his left middle finger. It should be pointed out that OJ had other injuries to his hand that were not depicted in the reenactment. OJ was examined the day after the murders. He had 7 abrasions and 2 other cuts on his left hand. The next strike is a superficial stab wound to the lateral border of the right clavicle, measuring 1/2 inch in length. The precise locations of the next 3 stab wounds were approximately 3 to 4 inches to the right of where they were depicted in the reenactment. First is a superficial stab wound of the right flank, 3/8 of an inch in length. The precise location of the wound was actually 3.5 inches to the back of the body, which would be about here on the side. This would be the last of Ron's effective resistance. The next stab wound is to the right side of the chest, 21 inches below the top of the head and 2 inches from the back of the body. The actual point of entry would be about here. It measures 1.5 inches in length, the direction is right to left, and the depth of penetration is 2 to 3 inches. This was a fatal stab wound associated with perforation of the lung and hemothorax. The next stab wound is also to the right side of the chest, this one being 22 inches below the top of the head and 5 inches from the back of the body. The pathway is from right to left, entering about here, and the angulation is actually back to front. Ron's 7th rib was totally incised, and the wound path travels 4 inches until it terminates in the 4th rib. This also was a fatal wound associated with perforation of the right lung and hemothorax. With Ron out on his feet, OJ comes around from behind and administers the final strike, a stab wound to the left side of the abdomen, located 45 inches above the left heel. The path is from left to right and slightly back to front. 2 perforating 1/2-inch wounds are in the wall of the aorta. The entire length of the wound path is approximately 5.5 inches. This too is a fatal wound associated with perforation of the abdominal aorta and internal hemorrhaging. Not depicted in the reenactment, the autopsy report describes a group of 5 superficial incise wounds on the right side of Ron's face, ranging from 1/4 inch to 5/8 of an inch in length. Because there was just a small amount of bleeding from these wounds, the coroner believed that these were inflicted after Ron was killed, as a means of confirming death. In total, Ron sustained 4 fatal stab wounds and more than 30 other stab wounds. After killing Ron, OJ turns back to Nicole. He pulls her head back by her hair and slices her neck from left to right. The gaping wound measured 5.5 by 2.5 inches in length and exposed the larynx and the cervical column. There was a 1/4-inch incised wound in the right jugular vein. The left jugular vein remained connected only by a thin strand of tissue, and both the left and right carotid arteries were completely severed. The massive slash was virtually a beheading, slicing her neck right back to the cervical vertebrae, where there was a 3/4-inch incised wound, a 1/4 inch deep in the bone itself. What deep flaw is it of human nature that would allow anyone to inflict such butchery upon another human being?